We are officially in the 2025 offseason, so let's dive into some Dynasty quarterback rankings as we head into rookie draft season, starting with Tier 1, just a very simple tier of Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jayden Daniels, and Jalen Hurts. I really don't know if I need to say anything else as to why these four are Tier 1 Dynasty quarterbacks, especially Allen and Lamar. They're both absolutely incredible, and Hurts has been a top 5 fantasy quarterback in points per game 3 years in a row now. The tush push lives on even with Saquon Barkley there, and he's getting to throw to A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith still. He's elite. Don't overthink it. I guess the only one that I will address is Jayden Daniels, as I have seen people ask if he's a sell high at the moment and that there is concern for a sophomore slump like we just saw with CJ Stroud. And to put it plainly, Jayden Daniels is not CJ Stroud, and I have no fears about a sophomore slump. Stroud threw for 4,100 yards and 23 touchdowns as a rookie. Daniels, while only throwing for 3,500 yards, did also toss 25 touchdowns, but then also ran for 900 yards and 6 touchdowns. He averaged 21.5 fantasy points per game as the QB5 on the season. Stroud averaged only 18.5 points per game as the QB10 as a rookie. They did not have an equivalent rookie season for fantasy because they are not equivalent quarterbacks in how they produce for fantasy football. And the worst part for Stroud was that we took his rookie season and then we piled on even more value when they added Stephon Diggs and Joe Mixon to the point of being a top 3 Dynasty quarterback this time last year. Daniels produced with Terry McLaurin, and then who? Olamide Zaccheaus, Dimey Brown, Noah Brown as his next best options? Sure, I mean, if and when they add someone this year, I'm sure it's going to artificially raise Daniels' value, but it won't be nearly the artificial jump that we applied to CJ Stroud last year, making Daniels less prone to the sophomore slump from a fantasy perspective. I think if you want a better comparison for Daniels after year 1, I would look at Kyler Murray, who finished as the QB 11 as a rookie, then went on to be the QB 2 in year 2, QB 4 in year 3. Or you could also look at Lamar Jackson, who is a top 10 quarterback as a starter as a rookie, then had his insane QB 1 year 2, then was QB 8 in year 3, averaging almost 23 fantasy points per game. That is the trajectory that I think better aligns with Daniels' career after his rookie year, not CJ Stroud's trajectory, which is why I am more than comfortable ranking him as the Dynasty QB3 and would not sell high just to sell high. Moving along into Tier 2, we get 3 more stud quarterbacks for Dynasty, starting first with Joe Burrow, coming off an absolutely bonkers season with over 4,900 yards, 43 passing touchdowns, plus an extra 202 on the ground. He is really good, guys. I mean, he is really good. And if the Bengals do find a way to keep T. Higgins and sign Jamar Chase long term, the fantasy points are just going to keep raining down. Even without T. Higgins, I would rank Joe Burrow this high and trust him as my Dynasty QB1, but it would also be nice if they kept T. Higgins. The only reason that he's not in Tier 1 is because he is not a mobile quarterback. 4,940 are elite numbers for fantasy, but he averaged just 1 more point per game than Jayden Daniels, who threw almost 1,500 fewer yards and 18 fewer touchdowns. That's how insane fantasy scoring is for rushing quarterbacks. If Joe Burrow were to drop down to even just 4,500 yards and 35 touchdowns next year, which is what he did in 2021 and 2022, then he would have averaged 19.6 fantasy points per game as the QB8 this year, which is still great, but it's not top 3. So that's the fine hairs that I'm splitting here as to why he's at the top of Tier 2, not in Tier 1. Then we have Patrick Mahomes, who at one point in the year was a very popular trade down name because of a lack of production, but then over the second half of the year, Mahomes returned to being Mahomes again for the most part. He averaged over 20 points per game on a 17-game pace of 4,300 yards and 34 touchdowns, plus another 302 on the ground. The passing volume returned. His yardage production spiked to 7 games over 260 yards over those final 10 weeks, plus 4 games with 3 passing touchdowns. Xavier Worthy had a second half spike. DeAndre Hopkins really stabilized their receiver room after Rashee Rice got hurt. Travis Kelce was still great. Everything just worked again for Kansas City and Mahomes for fantasy football. And that's really what I'm leaning into here with ranking Mahomes as a top 5 guy again. I mean, it is Patrick Mahomes after all. Sure, maybe this new phase of the Chiefs offense is trying to balance things out for their offense. Maybe Mahomes may not be a perennial 4,800 yards and 35 plus touchdown guy anymore, but that is still the ceiling because it is still Patrick Mahomes, and even his new average seasons of like 4,200 yards, 28 to 30 touchdowns is not bad either, and I'm more than okay with those seasons for the shot on his true upside of being Patrick Mahomes from just a few years ago. Then next up, we get to Justin Herbert, who did have a rocky start to the season, as most of us kind of expected, but then really turned it on over the second half of the year, averaging nearly 20 fantasy points per game from week 8 on as a top 12 fantasy quarterback. He was on a 17-game pace of 4,200 yards and 26 touchdowns, plus another 400 yards and 3 rushing touchdowns on the ground over that second half of the year, which really isn't all that different from what Mahomes was doing over that same second half stretch. And also like Patrick Mahomes, Herbert's receiving options also spiked in production, with Ladd McConkey turning into an NFL star, Quentin Johnston looking at least somewhat passable as a receiver, though still with stone hands at times. The tight ends offered some stability for checkdowns and moving the chains. It all worked for the Chargers to lean on their superstar NFL quarterback, which is really funny how that works, huh? And again, like Patrick Mahomes, we're also not super far removed from Herbert once throwing for 5,000 yards and 38 touchdowns either. He just got hurt last year, then this year had a new coaching staff, new offensive system, completely new weapons, and once all of that got put into place, Herbert started to succeed. So hopefully the Chargers continue to build out this offense. Maybe they sign T. Higgins or draft another wide receiver or even a tight end in this class like Trey Harris, Samika Egbuka, Harold Fannin Jr., even at the tight end position. Any investment into more weapons for Herbert should raise our confidence in him in this offense even more and allow us to trust him as an annual fantasy QB1 once again, like he was to end the year last year. All right, now we get into tier 3, and to kick off this tier at QB8 overall, this may surprise some people because it's a full 7 spots higher than his current Keep Trade Cut ranking. I have Baker Mayfield, and I know Baker has reclaimed our love for him since joining Tampa Bay last year, but I still feel like people hang on to the name Baker Mayfield and associate that with his Cleveland days or even worse, the Carolina Panthers here. Ugh. But play a game with me for a second. Remove the name Baker Mayfield and just think about this. Where else should we rank a 29-year-old quarterback, the same age as Patrick Mahomes and just a year older than Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson, coming off a 4,000-yard and 28 touchdown season in 2023, and then 4,500 yards and 41 touchdowns in 2024, plus another nearly 400 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. Now, maybe he's not QB8 overall for you, but how is that not at least a top 12 dynasty quarterback or even a top 10 dynasty quarterback? The offensive system that he's in is legit, coming straight from the Sean McVay tree with Liam Cohen. He still has Mike Evans. Maybe Chris Godwin re-signs in free agency, but if not, Jalen McMillan filled in very nicely down the stretch, and he even did it for fantasy without Mike Evans and Chris Godwin for those like 4 or 5 games mid-season. Again, you might think I'm crazy for ranking him at QB8 ahead of some other names that I'm going to get to in just a minute, but I think you're equally crazy if you're not considering Baker here after Patrick Mahomes and Justin Herbert based on his production in the past 2 years and the fact that he's still only 29, almost 30, which is not old at all for quarterbacks. So Baker Mayfield is my quarterback 8 at the top of tier 3. Then at QB9, we get to Kyler Murray. And again, this might come at a shock based on his 2024 season and his QB13 Keep Trade Cut ranking. I totally understand it, but did you know that Kyler Murray finished the year as the QB10 in total points and the QB12 in fantasy points per game? Kyler Murray was a fantasy QB1 in 2024. That is a statistical fact. Did it feel like it? Absolutely not. I had Kyler in way too many leagues and I hated every single minute of it. But at the end of the day, fantasy QB1, Kyler Murray in 2024. And I know why his season hurt more than Herbert's or Mahomes', despite all three averaging the same points per game all year. With Herbert and Mahomes, you had stretches of consistency, either good or bad, that you knew when you should or should not start them in your starting lineup. With Kyler, you never knew when to start him or sit him. It changed week to week. He put up back-to-back 20-point games just once in 2024. Only once, but to his credit, he never had back-to-back dud games either. His kill-death ratio was truly a perfect 1.0. Every single time he went below 15 points, he always came back with at least 17 the next week, if not even more likely 20 points the following week after a dud. So he was consistently inconsistent all year, and that sucked so much because you never truly knew when you could rely on him. All of that being said, we can't ignore that he was a fantasy QB1 in both total points and fantasy points per game, which he's been a fantasy QB1 in points per game 6 years in a row, which is actually every single year he's been in the league, and he's been a QB1 in total points in 4 out of those 6 years, all 4 of the years that he stayed completely healthy, all 16 or 17 games. Now, that is some consistency that not a lot of other quarterbacks can really match right now. So until Kyler truly falls off, he is not going to leave my top 10, especially with the upside that we've seen him have as a top 5 fantasy quarterback multiple years of his career. Then on my QB 10 spot is another surprise ranking to some, up 4 spots from his KTC ranking. We have Brock Purdy. And I want to do the same thing that we did with Baker Mayfield, this time just for Brock Purdy. Remove the name, remove the draft capital of Purdy. Where else should we rank a 25-year-old quarterback that is a year younger than Jordan Love and only a year older than Jayden Daniels, coming off a 4,300-yard and 31 touchdown season in 2023, and then 3,800 yards and 20 touchdowns in 2024, plus another 300 yards and 5 rushing touchdowns on the ground. And admittedly, right, those 2 seasons don't seem super similar, but 3,800 yards and 20 touchdowns came in just 15 games. So over 17 games, you're looking at more at 43 to 4,400 yards, 24-ish total touchdowns. So same number of yards, 7-ish fewer touchdowns. That is similar enough to me when you consider that he didn't have Ayuk for over half the year. Really felt like the entire year he didn't have Ayuk, but physically did not have Ayuk for most of the year. No Christian McCaffrey basically all year. Deebo Samuel was there more often in body than in spirit. Like, this was 4,300 yards and 24 touchdowns, throwing primarily to George Kittle and Juwan Jennings with a running game that was half as effective as it was in 2023. I don't know about y'all, but to me, that is impressive, and I think that deserves a top 10 ranking in Dynasty. Hopefully his throwing arm is okay still long-term, but removing that injury to end the year, I have no issues with Brock Purdy as my QB1. Love him even more if he is my QB2. And then to round out tier 3, we have the aforementioned Jordan Love, who very much like Purdy had a down year statistically compared to his 2023 campaign, but also like Purdy, missed 2.5 games and over a full 17 would have been on pace for 4,000 yards and 30 touchdowns, which again, not too dissimilar from his 2023 with 4,100 yards and 32 touchdowns. He also did way less on the ground, but I wonder how much of that is really due to the injuries that he had throughout the year. Regardless, Love is a young gunslinger with 2 very good seasons under his belt. He's still developing into his full potential as a starter and in this offense. His weapons are also developing too because they're all basically under like 25 years old. I do think that they would benefit from having a true alpha even for just a year or 2. I do think it would do wonders for their offense. Like if they went out and just signed Amari Cooper in free agency, I think that would be a massive upgrade over Romeo Doubs or Christian Watson now coming off the ACL tear. Or, I don't know, maybe they pull something crazy and they go trade for Tyreek Hill. Wouldn't that be absolutely wild? But either way, Jordan Love is very good. He's young, in a good offense, with good weapons, has a high ceiling on a weekly basis, and he comes in here at QB 11 to round out tier 3. All right, into tier 4. I'm just going to kind of drop the 4 players in this tier and then also summarize it because they're all very similar. We have CJ Stroud, Bo Nix, Drake May, Caleb Williams. So basically 3 2024 rookies, and then CJ Stroud falls into here off of a bad 2024. And the reason that I grouped all 4 of these guys together is because they've all shown elite upside and promise in some capacity. Stroud had an excellent 2023. Nix had a great 2024 as actually the QB 8 in fantasy points per game this year. May looked great given his situation. Caleb Williams had moments and is still Caleb Williams with great weapons around him, but they've all only done it once, and I need to see it again before I raise them any higher. That is the difference between tier 3 and tier 4. You'll notice looking back at tier 3, Kyler Murray, 6-time point per game QB1. Brock Purdy, back-to-back 4,000-yard seasons when you account for the injury. Jordan Love, same thing, back-to-back 4,000, 30-ish passing touchdowns when accounting for the injury. Even Baker, too, back-to-back great seasons with Tampa Bay, plus the prior success that he had in Cleveland, even if it wasn't to the same degree of success that he's having now. They've all done it at least twice, whereas Stroud, Nix, May, and Caleb have not done it. They've only done it once. And I get it, for 3 of them, that's not their fault. They were rookies, but I also want to learn from CJ Stroud here and not raise these guys up because they had a good year or just a few good weeks, and then their team adds some shiny new wide receiver and now they'll be even better. I don't want to do that with these rookies. I'm giving Jayden Daniels a pass because he was elite from the get-go and how he produced doesn't scare me for the future, and he was phenomenal all year long. You can't really say the same for these other 3 rookies though. Then as for CJ Stroud, it was just a bad year, and you can't even do the injury thing with him like we did for Love and Purdy because Stroud played all 17 and only got to 3,700 yards and 20 touchdowns. With Nico most of the year, Diggs for half the year, Tank Dell for really all but one game, plus he still isn't giving us much on the ground. He only had 230 yards, didn't score at all. On a points per game basis, CJ Stroud was the QB 31 this year. That is worse than Daniel Jones and Bryce Young and barely better than Mason Rudolph. Houston absolutely has some things that they need to figure out this offseason for sure. And until I see CJ Stroud return to fantasy QB1 form like he did in 2023, I can't put him any higher than this. And I was even tempted to put him at the bottom of this tier 2. And I don't blame anyone for preferring the rookies to CJ Stroud right now. All right, on to tier 5. It's a pretty simple tier of 2 kind of older but very productive veterans in Jared Goff and Dak Prescott. We know who Jared Goff is in Detroit. We've seen it for 3 years now. 4,429 in 2022, 4,530 in 2023, then 4,637 in 2024 on 70 fewer pass attempts than he had in 2023, which is absolutely crazy. The entire Lions offense was clicking on all cylinders, and they are just so insanely good. My only concern for Jared Goff is what happens if and when Ben Johnson leaves this year for a head coaching job. Who comes in to replace him? How much of a drop-off is there going to be offensively? Because Ben Johnson is one of the best play callers in the league. The last season that Jared Goff had without Ben Johnson in Detroit was back in 2021. He threw for 3,200 yards and 19 touchdowns in 14 games, which is more like 3,923 over 17, aka Justin Herbert in 2024. That was the last time Jared Goff didn't have Ben Johnson, but that was also Amon-Ra's rookie year. Hawkinson missed a few games. No Jameson Williams, no Jahmyr Gibbs, no David Montgomery, no Sam Laporta. The entire offense is completely different from now to then. So maybe there's a happy medium where Goff is still a fringe fantasy QB1 without Ben Johnson just because of all of the amazing talent and weapons that he has around him. And he's a great fantasy QB2 if you have him in Superflex leagues. Now, as for Dak Prescott, this one is baffling to me. It's like most people just forgot that Dak has been good basically every single year that he's been in the league. And after one mediocre and injured season, we've now left him for dead for fantasy. I mean, he's the QB 24 on Keep Trade Cut. And I have people asking me in my comments if he's worth buying for 1 first-round pick. Yes, Dak Prescott is worth more than 1 first-round pick in Superflex. If that is the price to acquire Dak right now, everybody should be buying him. Since 2019, in seasons where Dak played the entire year, he is averaging 4,600 passing yards and 34 passing touchdowns a season. Even last year, which was a terrible season, right? Only 8 games played, 17 game pace, 4,200 yards and 23 touchdowns. Essentially, the same stat line as QB 14 Geno Smith. And that includes the game he got hurt in. If you remove that game, Dak's pace is 4,500 yards and 24 passing touchdowns. The offense suffered from having no run game whatsoever, which I hope and do believe that they will address this year. Prayers up for Ashton Genty in the first round just for the fun of it for fantasy. But if they just figure out the run game, he still has CeeDee Lamb. He has Jake Ferguson. Jalen Tolbert looked good as a wide receiver 3. Maybe they can add a wide receiver 2 in the draft to replace Brandon Cooks. All of it is just 1 or 2 pieces to really optimize this offense again, and we're back in business. But even without those optimized pieces, I trust Dak Prescott because of his immense history of production for nearly a decade now that I can't imagine him ranked any lower than this. And if he truly is being valued outside the top 20, like Keep Trade Cut has him, he is the easiest buy in all of Dynasty football right now. Moving on to tier 6 now. This is a big tier of basically all the young quarterbacks who have upside, but also a lot of risk. And who better to be the poster child of that exact statement than Anthony Richardson at QB 18. Who Anthony Richardson is, I have no idea. I love him when he's running and he's scoring touchdowns, connecting with his wide receivers, but then I hate him when he's inaccurate and he's making dumb plays and he's being just a very inexperienced quarterback, because that's really what he still is. He has started and played as many games in college and the NFL as Aiden O'Connell has in the NFL alone. That is crazy to even think about how little experience Anthony Richardson has right now, which part of the reason is because he's been hurt a lot in the NFL, which we don't like, but he is also just super raw because he essentially only played just 1 year in college at Florida, and guess what? he's the same quarterback now as he was in college. He hasn't really developed all that much because he hasn't really had the time to develop all that much. All the athleticism and upside is there. All of the mistakes and the downside are also still there. So I have Anthony Richardson leading this tier because the entire tier is basically asking the question, will these guys figure it out and put it all together? And if Anthony Richardson does that, he would probably be a top 10, maybe even a top 5 Dynasty quarterback. His upside is that tremendously high. And that's what I'm chasing at this point. And most of you probably already know if you're in or out on Anthony Richardson. Nothing's going to change your mind at this point outside of the exact opposite happening on the field consistently. Then at QB 19, we have Trevor Lawrence, who I think is just here because I've seen some of it, but not all of it. Definitely not everything that we've needed to see to put him any higher than this. I do think that 2025 is his last chance in Jacksonville to show something before they basically like Daniel Jones him, but he is still a talented quarterback. He now has Brian Thomas Jr. entering year 2. We'll see what they do with the rest of the offense and the coaching staff this offseason. He's a fine quarterback. Maybe he is just a younger version of Derek Carr. I'm still personally hoping for more and hoping that he is still young enough that maybe he can figure it out on a new team, so he gets the nod here ahead of some other guys. At QB 20, we have J.J. McCarthy, who's actually the youngest quarterback in the entire rankings list still, minus some of the rookies that we'll get to in a minute, and in one of the most fantastic situations if he stays in Minnesota, because there are now rumors that the Vikings might keep Sam Darnold and trade away J.J. McCarthy. We'll see on that. We'll see how that plays out. But based on what Darnold did this year in that offense, it's really hard to imagine that J.J. McCarthy would not be able to at least match that when he gets the starting role. Everything is in place there for him with the coaches, the offense, the weapons. He just needs the starting job. At QB 21 then, in a very similar boat to McCarthy, is Michael Penix. Though we did get to see him as a starter to end the year, and I'd imagine that he's a starter moving forward as the Falcons move on from Kirk Cousins. Penix had his ups, he had his downs, any rookie would with their first few games, but when he was on, he was on. The weapons are all there, so we just need to give him some more time to develop into an NFL caliber quarterback. I really wouldn't want to have him as my QB2 as a contender just yet, but I'm also not super worried about it if he is right now because we have basically 9 months to figure that out before the 2025 season starts. QB 22 now is Bryce Young. Again, just more of the same here. A lot of upside, a lot of risk. Can he put it all together? Can the Panthers put more weapons around him? Can they click better in year 2 with Dave Canales? It's all the same questions, but he looked better over the second half of the season after being benched for Andy Dalton, so hopefully he continues with that and grows upon it in 2025. Then at QB 23, we get to Sam Darnold, who if we found out was staying in Minnesota for 2 to 3 more years, I would definitely rank him higher than this, but you can't tell me that right now, so the risk of him going somewhere else really scares me, and that's why he's down here instead of up behind like Jared Goff and Dak Prescott. I don't believe that Sam Darnold is all of a sudden fixed. This is not a Baker Mayfield situation to me because Baker was good for the most part in Cleveland. Sam Darnold was not good in New York. So if Darnold gets a bag to sign with like Vegas to fix their team with a new offense, a new coaching staff that isn't Kevin O'Connell, I'm going to be concerned because I don't think that Sam Darnold is fixed. I think he's a product of that offense and the weapons that he had, neither of which will most likely be there with any team that he signs to be as a starter. Vegas, Pittsburgh, either New York team. I don't see a path for Darnold to be a top 15 or even really a top 20 guy if he's not still the starter in Minnesota. Of course, on the flip side, if he stays in Minnesota and they do trade J.J. McCarthy, then sure, I'm going to raise him up because then he's basically a younger version of Geno Smith. But until I know that, I'm treating Sam Darnold more as a Dynasty QB3 that I can maybe stream instead of a locked-in QB2 every week kind of starter. Then at QB 24 to end tier 6 is Tua. I don't really know what to do here. It really seems like Tua's time in Miami could be closing just like Trevor Lawrence's in Jacksonville. Mike McDaniel might not even be the coach in 2026 either. Tyreek doesn't even seem like he'll be on the team in 2025. It's not looking great right now. I don't think we'll ever get to see him go back to his 2022 or even 2023 production. And if he's more like he was this year or even in 2021, which was just a 17-game pace of 3,800 yards, 23 touchdowns, like that's just a streamable QB2, which is fine, but I don't feel the upside there anymore with Tua, so he's a Dynasty QB2, but I'm not thrilled to have him here like I was maybe a year or two ago. And then we get to our last tier, tier 7. This is just all of the old guys. Geno Smith, Matthew Stafford, Derek Carr, Kirk Cousins, Russell Wilson, and Aaron Rodgers to round out the top 30. They're they're just guys, you know? I mean, a couple of them might not even be starters in 2025, who knows? But if they are, they'll be solid backups with very streamable weeks that no one really cares about because they're all in their mid to late 30s. Oh, and if I were to include the rookies into this tier list today in January, I would plug both of them in right between tier 5 and tier 6, so behind Jared Goff and Dak Prescott, but also ahead of Anthony Richardson and Trevor Lawrence. And my personal order right now is Cam Ward, then Shedeur Sanders. The reason I have them in this kind of tier 5B, we'll call it, is because I'm projecting both to go top 3 in the NFL draft right now, and there is some upside with all 3 QB-needy teams in that range that could be kind of good for fantasy football. Tennessee has an offense that worked in Cincinnati with Joe Burrow, plus they have Calvin Ridley, Tony Pollard, Tyjae Spears, Chigakonkwo, maybe hopefully another wide receiver too. Cleveland has Kevin Stefanski, and of course also has Jerry Jeudy, David Njoku, Cedric Tillman, maybe another wide receiver or a receiving back to replace Nick Chubb, like Travion Henderson or something. And then the Giants have Malik Neighbors. That's really about it, but it's a really, really good it. So assuming that both 2025 rookies go to 2 of those 3 spots, I really don't mind it for Dynasty, and their upsides are worth the shot for me over the semi-known but also still kind of unknowns of Richardson and Lawrence and Penix and McCarthy and Young, etc. And then also assuming that Jackson Dart finds his way into the first round in April, he'll probably be in tier 6B, we'll call it, depending on his ultimate landing spot. So there we have it, my current top 33 Dynasty quarterback rankings with the top rookies included now that we're officially into the 2025 offseason. Make sure to drop any and all questions in the comments down below. Call me an idiot if you want, but make sure that you're subscribed either way for more Dynasty content for the rest of 2025.